Well, I hope you're doing well this evening, and if you'll find in your Bible, Genesis chapter 11, that's where we'll be at this evening. And we're going to take prayer concerns before we get there. Chapter 11, and we will be wrapping up our our study of Genesis 1 through 11. Now, we're not finishing chapter 11, we're just finishing our study tonight because the rest of Genesis chapter 11 really actually fits in with our next study, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But we're going to be in verses 10 through 26 tonight, which is another genealogy in the Bible. And so we're going to be looking at that. And so I hope that you have been able to keep up with trying to read a chapter of these first 11 chapters every basically every day with your Bible reading, and that it has soaked in for you. Tonight, though, we are looking, like I said, again, at one of the genealogies, and, it's a whole lot of so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and he lived to be this many years old and had other kids. But the thing that I realized reading earlier this week as I was preparing for tonight's message, or tonight's study, is that this chapter, or this part of chapter 11, is really like bringing home some other things that we have already learned in our study in Genesis, and it'll be a reminder for us on other things that we've already learned, and sort of bringing it all full circle for us in some other things that we've learned in previous studies, in previous nights. And so as we looked last time that we were together, we looked in the first 9 verses of Genesis chapter 11. And we read about man's fateful decision to stay together and build a tower and build a city so that people would remember them. We've talked about the Tower of Babel last time. And in verses 10 through 26, what we read is another of the 25 genealogies in the Bible. We've already looked at a few in this particular study, but tonight we are looking at one of these genealogies that leads from Shem, Noah's son, to Abraham, or Abram as he's called in this particular part of the text. And so in this genealogy, we're going to learn more about that family line of Adam running to the Messiah, but we're looking at this snippet, this part in the genealogy from really Noah to Abram. And as we do this, we're going to go ahead and hold off on reading the scripture at length, because we're going to talk about it in depth as we go. And so we won't read the whole chapter or the whole section starting off. Now, the first thing that we notice, or I hope that you'll notice, is how this genealogy reads a little differently than the one in Genesis chapter 5. That's the one where we read about Adam lived to 930 years, and his son was Seth, and he was this old when he had Seth, and he had other sons and daughters, and then he died. Well, in this particular genealogy, I'll read verse 12 for us, and this will give you something to pay attention to, because the way that this reads is drastically different than Genesis chapter 5. It says in verse 12 that when Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. And after he became the father of Shelah, Arpachshad lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. Now, what does it say about him right before it says 403 years that he lived? Right. And so what they're talking about here is the fact that this particular genealogy focuses on life, where the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 focuses on death. Because in Genesis chapter 5, it's saying so-and-so had a son, he was this old when he had that son, he lived this many more years, then he died. And it's interesting that pre-flood they were focused on death, and post-flood the genealogy goes to focusing on the life, how long someone lived, rather than they lived, then they died. And we know that it's semantics to some degree in the way that you view it, but there is a lot of psychological difference to this too. And so, it is interesting when we see the way that this particular genealogy is worded. Now, we'll be reminded, as I said, of some other things that we have learned throughout our study of Genesis 1 through 11 as we work through this particular genealogy. But you'll see that we're told right there in verse 10 that Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood, meaning that Noah was 502 years old when Shem was born. And you're like, okay, well, what's the big deal, Pastor Nick? If you remember when we looked at the listing of Noah's sons, we saw that Shem was listed first, then Japheth, then Ham. And we know that there is a reference to Ham being the youngest child, so we know where he is in the chronological order of Noah's sons. But when we look back, I believe it's in chapter 6, it tells us, or at the end of chapter 5 maybe, that when Noah was 500 years old, he had his sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Well, if we know Ham is the last one, and we know that he started having children at 500, and this tells us that Shem was 2 or he was born when Noah was 502, then that shows us automatically the birth order. But it shows us more than that we'll talk about in just a little bit when it comes to the order of listings in those family names or those children because of prominence in the scriptures and other things. And so we'll talk about that again in just a little bit. But what we see, though, from this is that 100, when he was 100, Shem had his son, Arpachshad, and that was 2 years after the flood. And we're told that he would live to be 600. And so he was the last of the long lifers, so to speak. Noah lived, over 900 years, but he is the last one like that. Now we see in the next couple verses there that his son Arpachshad was 35. Now he's not waiting till he's 100 or 200 or even 500 like his grandfather Noah, but Arpachshad is 35 years old. That's a reasonable age even today for children to be born to a couple. And so it's kind of interesting that they immediately go from being hundreds of years old having children to all of a sudden after the flood, just a couple of generations, they're in the double digits and the low double digits at that. But what we see is that he had a son named Shelah, or Shelah, however you want to pronounce it, and Arpachshad went on to live to be 438 years. So we see automatically that from Noah living 900 plus years to Shem living to be 600 years old, then all of a sudden Noah's grandson is living half the lifetime that Noah had lived, or less than half of the lifetime Noah had lived. Then we read in the next couple verses where Shelah was 30 years old. Again, a reasonable age even today to have a child. Had a son named Eber, and Shelah lived to be 433 years. Again, half of what Noah would have lived to. But then we read where Eber had a child at 34, and his son's name was Peleg, as we've talked about before, and then it tells us Eber lived to be 464. But here's the catch. If you remember, this is the first one of those things that's sort of being wrapped up full circle for us that we've talked about previously as well, is that Eber is the one who the Jews or the Hebrews took their ethnicity from in name. Because Eber in the Hebrew is where they get the term Hebrews from. And so we talked about that at one point, that's where they get their ethnic identity, their national heritage, so to speak, and because Eber is the root from which they get the term Hebrew. And so we see that, again, that some of what we have talked about in the past in some of these studies is starting to come around again. But then his son, Peleg, is another one that we've talked about before. But he was 30 when he had a son named Reu, and Peleg went on to live to only 239, barely half what his father had lived. And so we see these drastic cuts in the length of lifespans with people. Now, Peleg was one that we learned when we studied in Genesis chapter 10, that he was the one that was alive when the earth was divided. And we talked about how Bible scholars believe that means that Peleg was alive during the time of the Tower of Babel when the earth was divided, in that mankind was divided over the earth. And so it's believed that Peleg was alive when languages were created, when people were scattered across the globe. And that puts, Peleg's lifespan puts the Tower of Babel, if you have one of those genealogies that I gave you to stick in your Bible for this study, it tells us that his life range would have been between 1757 and 1996 after creation. So somewhere around 1750 to 1996, as far as that many years after creation, was when Peleg lived. So there was this 100 to 340 year range right after the flood that people began to come together and build this city called Babylon and the Tower of Babel. And so we see that it was a very short period after the flood. It was 100 years. At the earliest, it would have been 100 years after the flood they started to build the tower in the city. But nevertheless, we see that his son, Peleg's son Reu, was 32 when he had a son named Serug, and Reu went on to live to be 239 as well. But not only that, Serug was 30 when he had his son named Nahor. And that's a name that you're probably familiar with if you've read in the book of Genesis much, that particular name. And Nahor was born, and his father lived to be 230 years. Now, Nahor was 29, again, a young age to be having children compared to some of his predecessors, but he had a son named Terah. And this is a name that you're probably familiar with too, having read sections of Genesis as well. And Nahor went on to live to be 148 years old. Now, Terah, we see he doesn't have children until he's 70. And with Terah, he had the first of his sons, which we don't know which one it was, but he had 3 sons named Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And we aren't certain which one was the oldest, because this brings us back to that whole idea that we talked about with Noah's sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Because when we look at this, we don't know where they fall in age. Abram could have very well have been the oldest one, but he may not have been either. We just don't know because we're not given that information. Because, with the genealogy or the listing of Noah's sons, Shem, who would be the one who would come to prominence in the next genealogy, in the next set of scriptures leading to Abram, Shem was listed first. Well, think about what happens in Genesis 12 through 25 when we start reading about a man named Abram. Well, he is listed first in this listing of the sons of Terah. And so we realize that Abram was in the front of the line in this listing, probably simply because he would be very important going forward. We just don't know. But the interesting thing about this is that as we look at these names and do a little bit of looking outside of Genesis chapter 11 where we're at, we find some interesting stuff about the sons of Terah. One thing we see is that Nahor was given a family name. His grandfather went by that name, and so he received a family name, much in the same way that we do that today. Andrew or Drew at Caswell, he goes by Andrew. At home in our house, he goes by Drew. But Drew, his middle name is Lee, and that's my middle name, and that's my dad's middle name. But it's also Misty's dad's middle name, and we just told them both they were named. He was named after each of them, and they were both happy, and so it worked out good. But he named after me. But anyway, and that's what Misty told me, so I believe her. But nevertheless, we see that sort of thing. People are given family names and stuff like that. My great grandfather, on the Wilson side, his name was Azor Sidney Wilson. And Azor, if you look in the genealogy in Matthew, is one of Jesus' predecessors. And Azor. It's kind of an interesting and odd name. I'd never heard anybody ever named that before until I was looking in our family history. And his father, John Wesley Wilson, was brothers with a man named Azor Lafayette Wilson, who interestingly had a granddaughter by the name of Doris Turner, which, if you remember, used to be one of our church members not too long ago. And so it's kind of interesting to find out a family connection when we came over here. But her grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, was the namesake for my great-grandfather. And so it's something that we see from time to time. We see people using these family names. And that's exactly what Terah did with his own son Nahor. He gave him his father or grandfather's name. But something else that we see here is that, as we'll later read when we get into Genesis a little bit later, we'll see that the son that is listed last, Haran, not to be confused with the land of Haran. It's a completely different spelling, but that's where they actually end up settling for a little while. Later, Abram's family does. But what we see is that Haran lived and died in the same place. He lived and died in the same town, city, community, whatever you want to call it. But what he did was he lived and died in the same place. And so just like when his brothers were born there, he just ended up dying there. And what this means is that Terah's family was living in this area called Chaldea. And the area of Chaldea is better known to you as the territory of Babylon. And this is where Abram, his two brothers, they were born, and his brother Haran died. And so what we see is that he was probably listed last in that family listing of the brothers because he was off of the pages of the family history sooner than his other two brothers. So we don't know who the oldest brother was or anything like that, or the chronology of the brothers, but what is kind of interesting is that the city that they lived in was the city of Ur, and you see it there on the screen there, a map of where Ur is in regards to Babylon, where they built the Tower of Babel and did that. But the interesting thing when we see this is there's 140 miles between Babylon and Ur, which doesn't really mean a whole lot other than the fact that there's a little bit of a distance there. But the interesting thing that we pick up on when we try to sort of step out and look at the context of everything we've been looking at is what happened in Babylon, the Tower of Babel. And after that, people were spread across the earth, languages were developed. But where does Shem's family end up landing? At least in the line of Terah and Abram, they end up in Ur. So they were not one of the people groups that was displaced by the Tower of Babel, which is important to us because once they start to travel, basically, make sure I'm looking at this right, northwest of Babylon and come around towards the coast where Israel is and Canaan, as Abram would go to. As they go and do that, that's the direction of their travel, and so they're locally central, or they're localized in that area before Abram is called by God, rather than being up towards Macedonia or some other place. And so it's interesting to see how God works this, that these people groups are spread all over the earth and languages are developed, and Abram stays in this, or is left in this area of Ur, or moves in that direction, and is centrally located for the narrative of the Bible as we see it going forward. And so, with the closing of this particular genealogy, this brings us to the end of our study on the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We've gone from creation to the Tower of Babel and really the genealogy after it, and it ends with the birth of Abram, which is crucial for the next 13 chapters of the book of Genesis, because when we finish our next Bible study, because we're going to be starting to look after Vacation Bible School, we'll start looking at 10 extraordinary women from the Bible. And when we get through with that series, we're going to get back into the book of Genesis, and we're going to pick up right where we're leaving off here with the birth of Abram. And so that's where we'll head, and we'll be able to pick back up in Genesis chapter 12 around the middle of November is when we'll be done because of different things going on. But before we completely wrap up tonight, we always talk about the first and the good that is found in these chapters. And the only first that I could find in this particular section of Genesis chapter 11 was in the line of Adam to Abram, was the first sub 365 year life or lifespan. And because if you remember, Enoch lived to be 365 years old, and up until Peleg is born, everybody lived, more than 400 years. And so we see that this is the beginning of the decline in the human lifespan, going from 969 years at Methuselah down to the lifespans that we read about in the scriptures, and even today what we experience. But beyond looking at just the first that we see in the book of Genesis in that particular text, we also look at what we can find is the good that God would use through this particular set of the text. And the good we find in Genesis chapter 11 has to do with the way that God can bring redemption from mankind's sinfulness. Because we see in verse 10 our final reference to the flood, at least in this section of Genesis. There's no longer a reference to the flood other than talking about how Shem was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. And so this is the last reference to the flood for a long time in the biblical story anyway, or in the biblical pages. But it's a reminder that the flood was still this major event that really had ramifications on mankind centuries later. Because the flood, again, was God's judgment against man's sinfulness. And what we see is that with the birth of Abram in verse 26 that we looked at today, what we see is that we have the beginning of the ultimate redemption of mankind. Now, yes, we look at the story of Noah and the ark and we say, yes, God redeemed mankind through Noah and what he did to save the humanity and to save all of the different animals on the ark. Yes, God brought about a great work of redemption with Noah and the ark. But as we'll read later in our next study of Genesis, is that specifically in Genesis 18 and chapter 18 and chapter 22, is that God will bless the nations of the earth through Abram or Abraham. And so, as we know, Abram will eventually be called Abraham, and through his family, Isaac and Jacob and Judah and David and Joseph and eventually Jesus, what we see is that is how God will bless mankind. The entire human race will be blessed because they will be given the opportunity to receive that redemption from their sins. And not to just be saved from a cataclysmic flood, but to be saved from an eternity in hell, all because of the sacrifice that Jesus makes. So, what we do in taking away from this, what we see in this section of Genesis chapter 11, as we think about it in this way, no matter what we do, no matter how far we stray from God, God offers us redemption. Despite our sinfulness, despite how much of an enemy of God we can be at times before we come to faith in Him, we see that He can do that. He offers us redemption despite our sinfulness. We see that with Noah and the ark. We see that with the family line that goes from Shem to Abraham and from Abraham to David and from David to Jesus. We see that. And just as important, we see that same fact in our own lives, that regardless of how long we turn away from Him or regardless of what sin we might commit, God has given us a chance to receive His forgiveness, to embrace that redemption that He offers to us. And all we have to do is confess our sin and seek it. And when we pursue the salvation and the forgiveness that He offers us, He gives it to us freely as a gift, as we talked about this morning. And so that wraps up our study of Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And as always, before we close out, are there any questions about the study from tonight? Good, I answered all your questions when I talked. No. Any questions or comments? All right. Well, if there's not any others, just a reminder that Wednesday night we will be in our series on encounters with the Lord. And just because I can't remember what it is this week, it is on the woman at the well. And so be sure to be here on Wednesday night at 7 for that. Next Sunday morning, I'm guessing that the stage will look a little bit different than it does this morning or today. And I see Gina back there nodding her head. And so Everything will look different because of Vacation Bible School. If you've not signed up to help and you still want to, I'm sure Gina can use the help somewhere. And so be sure to see her if you're still looking for a place to serve. And so next Sunday morning, we'll have our message from the Bible verse for Vacation Bible School, which is Ephesians 2:10. Is that correct? And then Sunday night, we won't have a Bible study because of Vacation Bible School, and we won't have any Wednesday night the week of Bible school either. And so we do have another baptism planned for the second Sunday in August. And so we have a young man that couldn't be here today because he's on vacation with his family, Caden Hudson. And so we'll be baptizing him on that Sunday, but we're also hopeful that some kids will come to faith during Bible school. And we'll be able to potentially baptize them that time as well. And I did have a parent come to me right before Sunday school and say that one of their children was asking good questions about Jesus and wanted to come sit down and talk with me. So be prayerful about that. We may have another one to baptize in September. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes. But be in prayer for that young man as well. And so I'm going to ask Dennis